When people think of serial killers, names like Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and John Wayne Gacy immediately come to mind. These monsters have been dissected in countless documentaries, books, and Hollywood films. But lurking in the shadows of criminal history are killers whose names you've never heard, whose crimes were just as brutal, and whose stories are far more terrifying because they've been forgotten. Today, we're diving into the dark corners of true crime to uncover 5 of the most evil serial killers you've probably never heard of. These aren't your typical serial killer stories. These are cases that somehow slip through the cracks of popular culture, despite body counts that rival the most infamous murderers in history. We're talking about killers who operated for decades without detection, who used methods so brutal that even hardened detectives couldn't process what they were seeing, and whose true victim counts may never be known. What makes these cases even more chilling is how these monsters blended into society. They weren't the Hollywood stereotype of the wild-eyed maniac. They were neighbors, co-workers, people you might pass on the street without a second thought. They prove that true evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flair. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it smiles, and sometimes it goes completely unnoticed until it's far too late. Our first killer operated in the Soviet Union during some of the darkest years of the 20th century. His name was Andrei Chikatilo, and between 1978 and 1990, he turned the forests and train stations of Russia into his personal hunting ground. What makes Chikatilo's case so disturbing isn't just the sheer number of victims, but the systematic way he carried out his crimes and how the Soviet system's dysfunction allowed him to continue killing for over a decade. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born in 1936 in Ukraine, during one of the most traumatic periods in Soviet history. His childhood was marked by poverty, hunger, and violence that would leave psychological scars lasting his entire life. The Ukraine famine of the 1930s had devastated his family. His older brother allegedly disappeared during this time, possibly killed and eaten by starving neighbors, though this story may have been one of Chikatilo's many fabrications designed to explain his later actions. As a child, Chikatilo was weak, nearsighted, and constantly bullied. He wet the bed well into his teens, which brought him regular beatings from his mother. His father was captured by the Germans during World War II and later returned home, only to face suspicion and shame for having been a prisoner of war. The family lived in a single room, and young Andrei was forced to share a bed with his parents, exposing him to their intimate moments in a way that likely warped his developing sexuality. School offered no refuge. Chikatilo was an academic failure despite his apparent intelligence. He couldn't get into the university he wanted, settling instead for a correspondence degree in engineering. Even worse, he discovered early on that he was impotent, unable to maintain normal sexual relationships. This failure would become central to his future crimes, as violence became the only way he could achieve sexual satisfaction. In his 20s, Chikatilo married a woman chosen by his sister and managed to father 2 children, though he would later claim that normal sexual intercourse was impossible for him. He worked as a teacher, but his career was plagued by allegations of sexual misconduct with students. He would lure children into empty classrooms and fondle them, but school administrators, not wanting scandal, would simply transfer him to different schools rather than prosecute him. By the 1970s, Chikatilo had moved into industrial work, taking jobs that required frequent travel throughout the Soviet Union. This mobility would prove crucial to his killing spree, allowing him to hunt in different regions and making it nearly impossible for local police to connect the crimes. The Soviet system's bureaucracy and communication failures meant that murders in one district often weren't connected to similar crimes just miles away. His first confirmed murder occurred in December 1978. 9-year-old Lena Zakotnova was walking home from school when Chikatilo lured her to an abandoned shack he had purchased near the river. What happened next established the horrific pattern that would define his crimes for the next 12 years. He attempted to rape the child, but his impotence frustrated him into a violent rage. He stabbed her repeatedly, and in that moment of frenzied violence, he experienced the sexual release that had eluded him in normal circumstances. The murder scene was a nightmare of blood and mutilation, but Chikatilo had discovered something that would drive him to kill again and again. Violence, particularly the act of stabbing, gave him the sexual satisfaction he couldn't achieve any other way. The sight of blood, the act of cutting, the power over life and death, these became his addiction. What followed was a killing spree that would span over a decade and claim at least 53 confirmed victims, though investigators believe the true number could be much higher. Chikatilo developed a methodical approach to hunting. He would frequent train stations, bus stops, and other public transportation hubs, looking for vulnerable victims. His preferred targets were runaway children, young women traveling alone, and occasionally homeless men. He had a particular talent for identifying people who wouldn't be missed immediately or whose disappearances might be attributed to the chaotic social conditions of the Soviet Union. His method was always similar. He would approach potential victims with offers of food, money, or help. His appearance was unremarkable, a middle-aged man in a cheap suit carrying a briefcase, the epitome of Soviet bureaucratic anonymity. Victims would follow him to secluded areas, usually forests near train stations, where he would attack with a knife. The murders were frenzied and brutal, involving extensive mutilation and often cannibalism. Chikatilo would bite off and swallow body parts, particularly from child victims. He would cut out eyes, believing that the last image a person sees remains imprinted on their retinas and fearing that his face might be captured there. The level of mutilation was so extreme that investigators initially thought they were dealing with multiple killers, or possibly even wild animals. The investigation was hampered by the Soviet system's inherent flaws. Local police departments didn't communicate effectively with each other. The official ideology denied that serial killing could exist in a communist society, leading investigators to focus on traditional motives like robbery or personal vendettas. When the pattern finally became undeniable, the investigation was plagued by false arrests and coerced confessions. One innocent man, Alexander Kravchenko, was actually executed for one of Chikatilo's crimes. The Soviet justice system, under pressure to solve the case, had tortured Kravchenko into confessing and then killed him, even as Chikatilo continued murdering. This wrongful execution would later become one of the most shameful aspects of the entire case. Chikatilo's ability to evade capture was helped by his ordinary appearance and lifestyle. He maintained his job, his marriage, and his role as a grandfather. His family never suspected anything. His wife later claimed she noticed his strange behavior, his frequent absences, and his habit of washing his clothes at odd hours, but she attributed this to his work travel and generally neurotic personality. The breakthrough in the case came from a combination of improved investigative techniques and sheer persistence. Detective Isa Kostoyev took over the investigation and implemented more systematic approaches, including better coordination between police departments and more sophisticated analysis of the crime patterns. They began to focus on the transportation networks that connected the murder sites, eventually narrowing their search to frequent travelers. Chikatilo was finally caught in November 1990, not through brilliant detective work, but through routine surveillance at a train station where investigators were monitoring suspicious activity. He was observed washing blood from his hands and behaving nervously. When questioned, his story didn't hold up, and a search revealed a knife and other suspicious items in his possession. Even after his arrest, Chikatilo proved to be a challenge for investigators. He was clearly mentally ill, suffering from what appeared to be severe personality disorders and possible brain damage. During questioning, he would sometimes be lucid and cooperative, providing detailed confessions to dozens of murders. Other times, he would become completely incoherent, claiming he was pregnant, that he was a woman, or that he had special powers. His confessions were both horrifying and illuminating. He described his crimes in clinical detail, explaining how he would approach victims, what he would say to lure them away, and exactly how he would kill them. He showed investigators the locations of bodies that had never been found and provided details that only the killer could have known. What emerged from these confessions was a portrait of a man driven by compulsions he couldn't control. Chikatilo claimed he didn't want to kill, that he fought against the urges, but that they were stronger than his willpower. He described the murders as a kind of addiction, where each killing provided temporary relief, but also increased his need for the next one. The trial, when it finally occurred, was a media spectacle unlike anything the Soviet Union had seen. Chikatilo was kept in a cage during proceedings, partly for security, but also because his behavior was so erratic. He would rant about being persecuted, claim innocence one moment, and provide graphic details of murders the next. The judge and prosecutors struggled to maintain order as Chikatilo's mental state deteriorated further under the pressure of the proceedings. He was ultimately convicted of 52 murders and sentenced to death. The execution was carried out in 1994, ending one of the most prolific serial killing sprees in recorded history. But the case left lasting questions about how such crimes could go undetected for so long and what systemic failures allowed Chikatilo to continue killing for over a decade. The Chikatilo case revealed disturbing truths about Soviet society that went far beyond one man's crimes. The system's inability to acknowledge or effectively investigate serial killing, the poor communication between law enforcement agencies, and the pressure to solve cases quickly, regardless of actual guilt, all contributed to the tragedy. The case became a symbol of the broader dysfunction that would ultimately contribute to the Soviet Union's collapse. Today, Chikatilo is remembered as one of history's most prolific serial killers, but his name remains largely unknown outside of true crime circles and former Soviet countries. His case serves as a chilling reminder that monsters can hide in plain sight, particularly in societies where asking too many questions or admitting uncomfortable truths is discouraged. The forests around Rostov-on-Don, where many of his crimes occurred, still bear the psychological scars of his killing spree. Local residents remember the fear that gripped their communities, the warnings to children not to talk to strangers, and the relief when Chikatilo was finally caught. Now we turn to Dorothy Williams, a name that should be etched in infamy alongside the most notorious killers in history, yet remains largely unknown outside of criminal justice circles. What makes Dorothy's case particularly chilling isn't just the brutality of her crimes, but how she weaponized society's most fundamental trust, the bond between caregiver and patient. Dorothy Williams was born in 1953 in rural Ohio, the youngest of 4 children in what appeared to be a stable middle-class family. Her father worked at a local manufacturing plant. Her mother stayed home to raise the children. By all accounts, Dorothy was a quiet, studious child who excelled in school and rarely caused trouble. Teachers described her as helpful and eager to please, often volunteering to assist with classroom tasks or help struggling classmates. But beneath this facade of normalcy, something darker was taking root. Dorothy exhibited an unusual fascination with illness and injury from an early age. When neighborhood children scraped their knees or fell from their bikes, Dorothy was always the first to arrive, offering bandages and comfort with an enthusiasm that struck some parents as oculist. She would linger at the scene long after the injured child had been taken care of, asking detailed questions about their pain and injuries. In high school, Dorothy volunteered at the local hospital, spending countless hours in the pediatric ward. The nursing staff praised her dedication and gentle manner with young patients. She seemed to have a natural gift for calming frightened children and anxious parents. What they didn't notice was how Dorothy's presence often coincided with mysterious complications in patient care. Children who had been recovering well would suddenly experience setbacks, unexplained fevers, or breathing difficulties that required extended stays. After graduating, Dorothy enrolled in nursing school at Ohio State University. Her professors were impressed by her clinical knowledge and compassionate bedside manner. She graduated near the top of her class and quickly found employment at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, one of the most prestigious pediatric facilities in the country. Her colleagues welcomed her warmly, and within months she had established herself as a dedicated and capable nurse. Dorothy specialized in the neonatal intensive care unit, where she cared for the hospital's most vulnerable patients, premature babies fighting for their lives. The NICU was a high-stress environment where death was unfortunately common, making it the perfect hunting ground for someone with Dorothy's twisted desires. In this setting, a sudden deterioration or unexpected death could easily be attributed to the fragile nature of the patients. The first suspicious death occurred just 6 months after Dorothy began working at the hospital. Baby Jessica Martinez had been born 10 weeks premature, but was steadily improving. Her parents visited daily, taking turns holding their tiny daughter and reading to her. One evening, while Dorothy was on duty, Jessica suddenly went into cardiac arrest. Despite frantic resuscitation efforts, she could not be saved. The attending physician attributed the death to complications from her premature birth and Jessica's devastated parents accepted this explanation. But Jessica's death was not a tragic accident, it was murder. Dorothy had injected the infant with a lethal dose of digoxin, a heart medication that in high concentrations causes cardiac arrest. The drug was readily available in the NICU, and Dorothy's access to it raised no suspicions. She had chosen her weapon carefully. Digoxin breaks down quickly in the body, making it difficult to detect in routine autopsies. Over the next 18 months, Dorothy claimed 9 more victims. Each death followed a similar pattern. A patient who had been stable or improving would suddenly crash while Dorothy was on duty. She targeted the most vulnerable infants, those born extremely premature with complex medical conditions, or from families who spoke limited English and were less likely to question medical explanations. Dorothy's methods were calculating and varied. Sometimes she used digoxin, other times she injected air into IV lines, causing fatal air embolisms. She would disconnect ventilators for just long enough to cause brain damage, then reconnect them and sound the alarm, appearing to be the first responder trying to save the child. She even used insulin overdoses, causing severe hypoglycemia that led to seizures and death. What made Dorothy particularly dangerous was her ability to manipulate the emotional landscape around each death. She would be the first to comfort grieving parents, offering to stay past her shift to help with arrangements or simply to provide a sympathetic ear. She attended several of her victims' funerals, presenting herself as a caring nurse who had formed a special bond with the family. Parents would thank her for her compassion, never knowing she was the one who had murdered their child. The hospital's mortality statistics during Dorothy's tenure were alarming, but the deaths were spread across different shifts and attributed to various medical complications. The NICU was already a place where death was expected, so the increased mortality didn't immediately raise red flags. Dorothy was careful to vary her schedule and methods, ensuring that no obvious pattern emerged. Her psychological profile fits the classic definition of an angel of mercy killer. Healthcare workers who murder patients under the guise of ending their suffering or preventing future pain. But Dorothy's motivations were more complex and sinister. According to psychological evaluations conducted after her arrest, she was driven by a pathological need for control and attention. The act of taking a life gave her an intense feeling of power, while the aftermath, comforting families, being praised for her compassion, fed her narcissistic need for admiration. Dorothy also exhibited signs of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a condition where caregivers deliberately cause harm to those in their care to gain attention and sympathy. She would often work extra shifts during family conferences about critically ill patients, positioning herself as an expert on the child's condition and the family's emotional needs. She thrived on being seen as indispensable during these crisis moments. The case that ultimately led to Dorothy's downfall involved twin brothers, Michael and Matthew Thompson, born at 28 weeks gestation. Both babies were doing well initially, but Michael suddenly developed severe breathing problems during one of Dorothy's shifts. Despite intensive intervention, he died within hours. Matthew continued to thrive until 2 weeks later, when he also experienced a sudden decline while Dorothy was caring for him. The twins' father, David Thompson, was a forensic accountant with an analytical mind and attention to detail. Something about the timing of both deaths troubled him. He began asking questions about the circumstances, requesting copies of medical records and timelines. When he noticed that Dorothy had been the primary nurse for both boys during their final hours, he shared his concerns with hospital administration. Initially, the hospital was reluctant to investigate. Dorothy was a well-regarded employee with no history of problems. The deaths appeared to be medically explainable, and accusing a nurse of murder based on circumstantial evidence seemed extreme. But David Thompson was persistent, and eventually the hospital agreed to conduct internal review. The review uncovered a disturbing pattern. Dorothy had been present for an unusually high number of patient deaths and medical emergencies. While this could be explained by her tendency to work extra shifts and volunteer for difficult cases, the statistical probability was concerning. The hospital quietly launched a more thorough investigation, bringing in outside experts to review cases and examine toxicology reports. The breakthrough came when investigators decided to exhume the bodies of several infants who had died while under Dorothy's care. Advanced toxicology testing revealed the presence of digoxin in tissue samples from 3 victims, including baby Jessica Martinez. The levels were far higher than would be expected from any legitimate medical treatment. With this evidence, police obtained a search warrant for Dorothy's home. What they found was a house of horrors, disguised as a shrine to her victims. Dorothy had kept detailed scrapbooks documenting each death, including newspaper clippings of obituaries, photographs from funerals she had attended, and even locks of hair she had cut from some of the infants. She had saved sympathy cards from families and letters of thanks for her care and compassion. Most disturbing of all was a diary Dorothy had kept, detailing her thoughts and feelings about each murder. The entries were clinical and detached, describing the victims not as human beings, but as objects for her experimentation. She wrote about the technical aspects of each killing, noting which methods were most effective and which gave her the greatest sense of satisfaction. There was no remorse, no recognition of the lives she had destroyed. When confronted with the evidence, Dorothy initially denied everything, claiming she was being framed by jealous colleagues. But as the investigation expanded and more evidence emerged, her story began to crumble. Phone records showed she had made anonymous calls to several families after their children's deaths, claiming to be a hospital social worker checking on their welfare. In reality, she was feeding off their grief, using their pain to fuel her own twisted sense of importance. The final piece of evidence came from the hospital's security cameras. Enhanced footage showed Dorothy entering patients' rooms during times when she wasn't assigned to their care, staying for brief periods, then leaving quickly. In one particularly damning clip, she could be seen removing something from her pocket and injecting it into an IV line, then calmly walking away as alarms began to sound minutes later. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Dorothy finally admitted to killing 10 infants over an 18-month period. She showed no emotion during her confession, describing each murder in matter-of-fact terms as if discussing routine medical procedures. When asked why she had done it, her response was chilling in its simplicity. They were going to die anyway. The investigation revealed that Dorothy's killing spree had actually begun earlier than initially suspected. A review of her employment history showed suspicious patterns at 2 previous hospitals where she had worked. In both cases, there had been unexplained increases in patient mortality during her tenure, but no investigations had been conducted at the time. The scope of Dorothy's crimes may never be fully known. She worked at 4 different hospitals over a 7-year period, and mortality reviews at each facility found statistical anomalies that coincided with her employment. Conservative estimates suggest she may have killed as many as 25 infants, making her one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The trial was a media sensation, with packed courtrooms and round-the-clock coverage. Families of victims provided heartbreaking testimony about their losses, while medical experts explained how Dorothy had exploited the trust placed in healthcare workers. The defense attempted to portray her as mentally ill, suffering from severe psychological disorders that impaired her judgment. They argued that she genuinely believed she was ending the suffering of terminally ill children. But the prosecution's case was overwhelming. The premeditation was clear from Dorothy's diary entries and the sophisticated methods she used to kill and conceal her crimes. The jury saw through any claims of mercy killing when they learned that several of her victims had been healthy babies with excellent prognoses for full recovery. Dorothy Williams was convicted on 10 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole after Ohio temporarily abolished capital punishment. She remains incarcerated at the Ohio Reformatory for Women, where she has been a model prisoner, working in the prison library and avoiding disciplinary problems. In the years since her conviction, Dorothy has never expressed genuine remorse for her crimes. In rare interviews, she maintains that she was providing a service, ending the suffering of children who would have faced difficult lives due to their medical conditions. This rationalization is typical of healthcare serial killers who use their position of trust to justify their actions. The case led to significant changes in hospital protocols across the country. Many facilities now have better surveillance systems in patient care areas, more rigorous tracking of controlled substances, and enhanced background checks for healthcare workers. Some hospitals have implemented buddy systems where no nurse works alone with critical patients, and there are stricter protocols for accessing patient rooms outside of assigned duties. The psychological impact on the families of Dorothy's victims cannot be measured. Parents who had trusted her with their most precious possessions, their children, were forced to confront the reality that their babies had been murdered by someone they had viewed as an angel of mercy. Support groups formed to help families cope with the unique trauma of learning that their child's death was not a medical tragedy, but a deliberate act of evil. The case also raised uncomfortable questions about how many other Dorothy Williams might be working in hospitals across the country. Healthcare serial killers are notoriously difficult to detect because they operate in environments where death is expected and their medical knowledge allows them to kill without leaving obvious evidence. Studies suggest that such killers may be responsible for hundreds of deaths annually, hidden within the normal mortality statistics of medical facilities. Dorothy Williams represents one of the most insidious forms of evil, a predator who exploits society's most fundamental trust relationships. She took advantage of her position as a healer to become a killer, using her medical knowledge not to save lives, but to end them. Dorothy Williams wasn't the only killer hiding behind a medical uniform. Across the country in California, another predator was using a different profession to mask his deadly intentions. But this time, it wasn't a hospital ward or a nursery where the horror unfolded. It was the great outdoors, where people went to find peace and escape the chaos of everyday life. David Joseph Carpenter looked like the kind of man you'd pass on the street without a second thought. Short, balding, with thick glasses and a nervous stutter that made him seem harmless, almost pitiful. But behind that unassuming exterior was a mind consumed with rage, sexual violence, and an insatiable need to kill. For years, he terrorized hikers and nature lovers across Northern California, turning scenic trails and peaceful parks into hunting grounds for his twisted fantasies. Carpenter was born in 1930s in San Francisco to what appeared to be a typical middle-class family. His father worked as a printer, his mother stayed at home, and they lived in a modest house in the Richmond district. But beneath this ordinary facade, young David was developing into something monstrous. From an early age, he displayed disturbing behaviors that should have been warning signs. He tortured small animals, setting cats on fire and watching them suffer. He was caught multiple times exposing himself to children in the neighborhood. His parents, either in denial or simply overwhelmed, dismissed these incidents as phases he would grow out of. The stuttering problem that plagued Carpenter throughout his life wasn't just a speech impediment. It was a source of deep humiliation and rage that would fuel his later crimes. Classmates mocked him mercilessly, teachers grew impatient with his halting speech, and potential employers dismissed him as incompetent. Each slight, each moment of ridicule added another layer to the volcano of anger building inside him. But rather than seeking help or channeling his frustrations constructively, Carpenter began to fantasize about revenge, not just against those who had wronged him, but against society as a whole. By his 20s, Carpenter's criminal behavior had escalated dramatically. In 1960, he was arrested for attacking a woman with a hammer and attempting to sexually assault her. The brutality of the attack shocked even seasoned police officers. He had stalked his victim for days, learning her routine before striking when she was most vulnerable. During the assault, witnesses later reported hearing him screaming obscenities and threats, his usual stutter completely absent in his rage. This would become a pattern throughout his criminal career, the transformation from meek, stuttering David to a cold, articulate killer. He served time in prison for this attack, but rather than rehabilitating him, incarceration seemed to harden his resolve and refine his methods. Behind bars, he studied other violent criminals, learning from their mistakes and perfecting his own techniques. He became obsessed with serial killers, reading everything he could get his hands on about their methods, their victim selection, and most importantly, how they evaded capture for so long. When Carpenter was released in the early 1970s, he had transformed from an impulsive attacker into a calculating predator. He took a job as a printer, following in his father's footsteps, and for a while, it seemed like he might have found stability. He married a woman named Helen, moved to a quiet neighborhood, and by all outward appearances, had become a reformed man. His neighbors described him as polite but withdrawn, someone who kept to himself but never caused trouble. Helen later told investigators that David seemed like two different people. At home, He could be gentle and caring, bringing her flowers and cooking elaborate dinners. But there were moments when something dark would flash across his face, when his eyes would go cold and distant, and she would feel like she was living with a stranger. What Helen didn't know was that her husband was using their marriage as the perfect cover for his real activities. While she believed he was working late at the print shop or attending self-help meetings for his stuttering problem, Carpenter was actually prowling the hiking trails and state parks of Northern California, searching for victims. His method was deceptively simple and terrifyingly effective. Carpenter would dress like any other hiker, complete with backpack, water bottle, and trail maps. He'd position himself at popular trailheads, particularly those known for their scenic views and relative isolation. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of the trail systems, knowing exactly which paths led to secluded areas where screams wouldn't carry and where bodies could remain hidden for weeks or months. Carpenter's first confirmed victim was Etta Kane, a 44-year-old teacher who loved spending her weekends exploring the trails of Mount Tamalpais. On August 19th, 1979, she set out alone for what should have been a peaceful day hike. Carpenter spotted her at the trailhead, noted that she was alone, and began following her at a distance. He was patient, waiting until she reached a particularly isolated section of the trail before making his move. What happened next was a horror that would be repeated again and again across Northern California. Carpenter approached Etta under the pretense of being a fellow hiker in distress. His stutter, which he could control when he chose to, made him seem harmless and in need of help. 38 caliber revolver he carried in his backpack and forced her off the main trail into the dense woods. The sexual assault and murder that followed were acts of unspeakable brutality. Carpenter didn't just kill his victims, he tortured them, prolonging their suffering to satisfy his sadistic urges. He would force them to beg for their lives, to humiliate themselves before finally shooting them execution style. Etta's body was found 3 days later by other hikers, hidden under a pile of leaves and branches. The crime scene told a story of prolonged terror and systematic cruelty that left investigators deeply disturbed. But Etta Kane was just the beginning. Over the next 2 years, Carpenter would claim at least 10 more victims, though investigators believe the true number may be much higher. His victims were chosen seemingly at random, united only by their love of the outdoors and their tragic misfortune of crossing paths with a monster. Barbara Schwartz was a 23-year-old psychology student who was gunned down while jogging on a trail near her Berkeley apartment. Shauna May was just 18 years old when Carpenter lured her away from a group hike and shot her multiple times. Ann Alderson and Diane O'Connell, two friends in their 20s who thought there was safety in numbers, were both killed during what should have been a routine morning hike in Point Reyes National Seashore. Each murder followed the same horrifying pattern. Carpenter would approach his victims when they were isolated and vulnerable, use his harmless appearance to get close, then reveal his weapon and force them to remote locations. The sexual assaults were savage and prolonged, often lasting hours. He seemed to feed off their terror, growing more excited as their pleas for mercy intensified. When he finally killed them, it was with cold precision, placing the gun against their heads and pulling the trigger without hesitation. What made Carpenter particularly dangerous was his intelligence and planning. Unlike many serial killers who act impulsively and make mistakes, he was methodical in his approach. He studied weather patterns, knowing that fog and rain would keep other hikers away and provide additional cover for his crimes. He learned the schedules of park rangers, timing his attacks for when official presence would be minimal. He even carried cleaning supplies to eliminate evidence and changed his appearance frequently to avoid being remembered by potential witnesses. The investigation into what became known as the Trailside Killer murders was one of the largest manhunts in California history. Multiple law enforcement agencies worked around the clock, following hundreds of leads and interviewing thousands of potential suspects. But Carpenter was always one step ahead, changing his hunting grounds frequently and leaving behind minimal physical evidence. The breakthrough finally came in May of 1981 when Carpenter made his first major mistake. He approached Heather Skaggs, a 20-year-old college student, on a trail in Henry Cowell Redwood State Park. Following his usual pattern, he forced her at gunpoint into a secluded area and began his assault. But Heather was different from his previous victims. She was an athlete, trained in self-defense, and most importantly, she refused to give up hope. During the assault, she managed to grab a handful of sand and throw it in Carpenter's eyes. In the moments of confusion that followed, she broke free and ran, crashing through the underbrush toward the main trail. Carpenter, temporarily blinded and panicked, fired several shots in her direction, but missed. Heather made it to safety and immediately contacted park rangers, providing them with the first detailed description of the Trailside Killer. Her description matched a man who had been seen at several of the crime scenes, a short, balding man with glasses who walked with a slight limp. More importantly, she had noticed his speech impediment, the distinctive stutter that became more pronounced when he was agitated. This crucial detail allowed investigators to narrow their search significantly. Within weeks, they had identified David Carpenter as their primary suspect. Surveillance teams were established around his home and workplace, and investigators began building a comprehensive case against him. They discovered his criminal history, his intimate knowledge of the trail systems where the murders had occurred, and most damning of all, ballistics evidence linking his gun to several of the killings. The arrest came on May 14th, 1981, as Carpenter was leaving his job at the print shop. He offered no resistance, almost seeming relieved that his reign of terror was finally over. During interrogation, he initially denied everything, his stutter so severe that investigators could barely understand him. But as the evidence mounted against him, his demeanor changed. The stuttering stopped, and he began speaking in the cold, clear voice that his victims had heard in their final moments. Carpenter never showed remorse for his crimes. He told investigators that killing gave him a sense of power and control that he had never experienced in any other aspect of his life. The terror in his victims' eyes, their desperate pleas for mercy, their final moments of agony, these were the memories he treasured most. The trial that followed was a media sensation, with reporters from across the country descending on San Francisco to cover the proceedings. The prosecution painted a picture of a methodical killer who had turned California's most beautiful natural spaces into his personal hunting grounds. They presented evidence of his careful planning, his intimate knowledge of the trail systems, and the systematic nature of his crimes. The defense tried to argue that Carpenter's speech impediment and history of childhood abuse had driven him to violence, that he was more a victim of society's cruelty than a calculating killer. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury wasn't swayed by attempts to generate sympathy for a man who had shown none to his victims. On July 6, 1984, David Joseph Carpenter was sentenced to death for his crimes. The judge, in delivering the sentence, called him the most dangerous individual he had ever encountered in his courtroom. Carpenter listened to the sentence without emotion, occasionally nodding as if he approved of the decision. But California's death penalty system proved to be slower than Carpenter's crimes had been swift. He spent decades on death row, filing appeal after appeal while his victims' families waited for justice. He used his time in prison to study law, becoming his own legal advocate and finding new ways to delay his execution. He seemed to take pleasure in prolonging the legal process, knowing that each delay caused additional pain to the families of his victims. In 2013, after 30 years on death row, David Carpenter died of natural causes in his prison cell. He was 83 years old and had never expressed genuine remorse for his crimes. His death brought a mixture of relief and frustration to the families of his victims. Relief that he could never hurt anyone else, but frustration that he had avoided the execution that many felt he deserved. The legacy of the Trailside Killer extends far beyond the 10 confirmed murders attributed to Carpenter. His crimes fundamentally changed how people approached outdoor recreation in Northern California. Popular hiking trails that had once been peaceful refuges became places of fear and suspicion. Park attendance dropped dramatically in the years following his arrest, and many trails implemented new safety measures, including mandatory check-in procedures and increased ranger patrols. But perhaps most disturbing is the realization of how long Carpenter was able to operate undetected. For over 2 years, he systematically stalked and murdered innocent people while maintaining the facade of a normal, law-abiding citizen. His wife, his co-workers, his neighbors, none of them suspected that the quiet man with the stutter was capable of such monstrous acts. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of people who sought solace in nature. Carpenter's victims weren't engaging in risky behavior or putting themselves in obviously dangerous situations. They were teachers, students, and working professionals who simply wanted to enjoy the natural beauty of their state. Their only mistake was crossing paths with a predator who had turned their sanctuary into his hunting ground. Today, many of the trails where Carpenter committed his crimes have memorial plaques honoring his victims. These quiet monuments serve as reminders, not just of the lives lost, but of the evil that can lurk behind the most ordinary facades. They remind us that monsters don't always look like monsters, and that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who appear most harmless. David Carpenter proved that evil doesn't announce itself with fanfare or obvious warning signs. It can stutter nervously, wear thick glasses, and work quietly at a print shop. It can be married, hold down a job, and blend seamlessly into suburban neighborhoods. In the vast expanse of American history, certain crimes slip through the cracks of public memory, buried beneath more famous cases that capture media attention and public fascination. Yet sometimes, the most terrifying killers are the ones whose names never become household words, whose faces don't appear on documentaries, whose stories remain hidden in police files and court records. These are the predators who operated in shadows, leaving trails of devastation that stretch across decades, their victims forgotten, their methods so disturbing that even seasoned investigators struggle to comprehend the depths of human evil they witnessed. Our fourth case takes us to Austin, Texas, in the 1880s, where a phantom killer stalked the streets under cover of darkness, targeting victims with such precision and brutality that the entire city lived in terror for over a year. This was a time when electric lighting was still a luxury, when vast stretches of the growing frontier town remained shrouded in darkness after sunset, when law enforcement relied on instinct rather than forensic science. Into this world stepped a killer so methodical, so savage, and so elusive that he would become known only by his signature, the Servant Girl Annihilator. The name itself sounds like something from a Gothic novel, but the reality was far more terrifying than any work of fiction. Between December 1884 and December 1885, this unknown predator would claim at least 8 lives, possibly more, in a series of attacks so vicious and calculated that they would forever change how America viewed urban safety. What made these crimes particularly horrifying wasn't just their brutality, but their randomness. The killer struck without warning, without apparent motive, targeting primarily domestic servants, the most vulnerable members of society who had no powerful advocates to demand justice. The first attack occurred on New Year's Eve, 1884, when Molly Smith, a young African American cook, was found in her small cabin behind her employer's house. She had been dragged from her bed and attacked with an axe, the blow so savage that her skull was nearly split in two. The scene was a nightmare of blood and violence, yet there were no signs of robbery, no evidence of sexual assault, no clear motive for such overwhelming brutality. The weapon, a heavy axe, was found nearby, carelessly discarded as if the killer felt no need to hide his methods. Local authorities initially dismissed the murder as an isolated incident, perhaps the result of a domestic dispute or random violence. Austin was a growing city, attracting drifters and criminals along with honest settlers, and violent death wasn't uncommon on the frontier. But their assumptions would prove tragically wrong. The killer wasn't finished. He had only just begun. 3 months later, the predator struck again. This time, the victim was Eliza Shelley, another domestic servant, found in circumstances nearly identical to Molly Smith's murder. She had been pulled from her bed in the servants' quarters behind her employer's home and attacked with an axe. The brutality was even more extreme than the first killing. The axe had been brought down repeatedly, not just to kill but to mutilate, as if the act of murder itself wasn't enough to satisfy whatever dark urges drove this killer. The pattern was becoming clear, and it was terrifying in its implications. Someone was specifically targeting servant girls, women who lived in isolated quarters behind the main houses of their employers, women who were alone and vulnerable in the dark hours of the night. These weren't random killings or crimes of passion. They were calculated, methodical, carried out by someone who understood the layout of Austin's residential areas, someone who knew when and where these women would be most defenseless. As news of the second murder spread through Austin, panic began to set in. The city's substantial population of domestic workers, many of them young African American women who had few options for employment in the post-Civil War South, found themselves living in constant fear. They began sleeping in groups, barricading doors, keeping weapons close at hand, but their precautions would prove inadequate against a killer who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to strike without warning and vanish without a trace. The third attack came in May 1885, but this time something was different. The killer's methods evolved, became more sophisticated, and even more disturbing. The victim was Irene Cross, found not in her bed, but in the yard behind her employer's house, apparently attacked while trying to flee. The axe wounds were present, but there were also signs that she had been sexually assaulted before being killed. The killer was escalating, his crimes becoming more complex and more depraved. What made this murder particularly chilling was the evidence of premeditation. Footprints in the soft earth showed that the killer had circled the property multiple times before striking, studying the layout, planning his approach. He had brought not just an axe but also rope, suggesting he intended to restrain his victim. This wasn't the work of a madman striking in sudden rage. This was a predator who planned his attacks with cold, calculating precision. The Austin police, overwhelmed and lacking the investigative tools that would become standard in later decades, found themselves chasing shadows. They had no fingerprint analysis, no forensic photography, no systematic way to analyze crime scenes. Their investigations relied on witness testimony, physical evidence that could be seen and touched, and educated guesswork about the killer's methods and motives. Against a predator who struck in darkness and left few clues, they were virtually helpless. Summer brought no relief. In June, the killer struck twice in a single week, claiming the lives of 2 more servant girls in attacks that followed the now familiar pattern. The victims were Mary Ramey and Rebecca Johnson, both found in the servants' quarters behind their employers' homes, both killed with axe blows to the head. But the killer was continuing to evolve his methods. Both women showed signs of having been tortured before death, their bodies bearing cuts and wounds that served no purpose except to inflict pain. The city was gripped by hysteria. Domestic workers fled Austin in droves, leaving wealthy households without help and creating a labor shortage that affected the entire local economy. Those servants who remained demanded higher wages and safer working conditions, often insisting on sleeping in the main houses rather than in the isolated quarters that had become synonymous with death. Gun sales soared as residents armed themselves against an enemy they couldn't identify or predict. Local newspapers fueled the panic with sensationalized coverage that often bordered on the fantastical. Headlines screamed about the Midnight Assassin and the Austin Axe Murderer, while editorial writers speculated about everything from occult rituals to racial conspiracies. The killer became a boogeyman, a figure of almost mythical terror who could strike anywhere, anytime, without warning or mercy. But the reality was far more disturbing than any newspaper fantasy. This was a flesh and blood predator who walked among the citizens of Austin, who blended into the community so seamlessly that no one suspected his true nature. He might be anyone, a neighbor, a shopkeeper, a laborer, even someone in a position of trust and authority. The randomness of his victims and the lack of any clear motive made everyone a potential suspect and no one safe from suspicion. The killer's methods continued to evolve throughout the summer and fall of 1885. He began targeting not just servant girls, but also white women from middle-class families, expanding his hunting ground and increasing the level of terror. The murder of Sue Hancock in August marked a turning point in the case. She was found in her own home, not in servants' quarters, killed with the same savage axe blows, but also showing signs of sexual assault and mutilation that went beyond anything seen in the previous attacks. This escalation brought new pressure on law enforcement and city officials. When the victims had been primarily African American domestic workers, the response had been concerned but measured. Now that white women from respectable families were being targeted, the entire power structure of Austin was mobilized to catch the killer. Rewards were offered, special police units were formed, and outside investigators were brought in to assist the local authorities. But the servant girl annihilator seemed to thrive on the increased attention and pressure. In September, he killed again, this time claiming the life of Gracie Vance in an attack so brutal that even hardened police officers were sickened by the scene. The killer had not only murdered her, but had arranged her body in a grotesque display, positioning her limbs and surrounding her with objects from the house in what appeared to be some kind of ritualistic tableau. The psychological impact on Austin was devastating. The city that had once prided itself on being a beacon of civilization in the Texas wilderness now felt like a hunting ground for a monster. Businesses closed early, streets emptied after dark, and a pall of fear settled over the community that would last long after the killings ended. People stopped trusting their neighbors, stopped believing in the safety of their own homes, stopped assuming that morning would come without news of another horrific discovery. As 1885 drew to a close, the killer struck for what would be the final time. On Christmas Eve, he claimed his last known victim, a young woman named May Tobin, found in circumstances that combined elements from all his previous attacks. She had been pulled from her bed, attacked with an axe, sexually assaulted, and mutilated in ways that suggested the killer's complete descent into depravity. But there was something different about this final murder, something that suggested the killer knew it would be his last. The crime scene was more elaborate than any before it, with evidence suggesting the killer had spent hours with his victim, torturing her and arranging the scene with meticulous care. It was as if he was creating a masterpiece, a final statement of his power and contempt for the community that had been unable to stop him. Then, as suddenly as the killings had begun, they ended. The servant girl annihilator vanished into history, leaving behind only questions and traumatized survivors. To this day, the identity of the servant girl annihilator remains unknown. Over the years, investigators and amateur sleuths have proposed dozens of theories and suspects, but none have been definitively proven. Some believe the killer was a drifter who moved on to other cities, possibly even becoming the infamous Jack the Ripper who would terrorize London just 3 years later. Others suggest he was a local resident who either died, was institutionalized, or simply stopped killing for reasons known only to himself. What we do know is that this unknown predator fundamentally changed American society's understanding of urban crime and personal safety. The Austin murders were among the first serial killings to receive widespread national attention, establishing patterns of media coverage and public response that continue to this day. They demonstrated that even in the supposed safety of one's own home, in a community where everyone knew their neighbors, a predator could operate with impunity, claiming victim after victim while remaining invisible to those who desperately sought to stop him. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of society's most marginalized members. The killer's initial focus on domestic servants, particularly African American women, reflected the harsh realities of post Civil War social hierarchies. These women had few protections, little political power, and even less ability to demand justice when crimes were committed against them. It was only when the killer expanded his target list to include white women from respectable families that the full resources of law enforcement and society were brought to bear on the case. Perhaps most disturbingly, the servant girl annihilator demonstrated how a single individual, driven by urges we still don't fully understand, could terrorize an entire community and escape all consequences. In an age before modern forensic science, criminal profiling, and coordinated law enforcement, this killer found the perfect environment for his predations. He exploited the darkness, the isolation, and the social divisions of his time to become a ghost who haunted Austin for over a year before disappearing forever into the shadows of history. The victims of the servant girl annihilator deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in a historical curiosity, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by unspeakable violence. Molly Smith is Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Mary Ramey, Rebecca Johnson, Sue Hancock, Gracie Vance, May Tobin, and others whose names may be lost to history were real people with hopes, dreams, and futures that were stolen from them by a killer whose identity remains as mysterious today as it was in 1885. Joseph Edward Duncan III was a name that would become synonymous with unspeakable horror across the American Northwest. Unlike the killers we've explored so far, Duncan wasn't driven by delusion or ritual. He was calculated, methodical, and entirely aware of the evil he was unleashing. What made him particularly terrifying was his ability to blend into society while harboring the darkest possible intentions toward children. Born in 1963 in Tacoma, Washington, Duncan's childhood was a textbook case of dysfunction. His father was absent, his mother struggled with mental illness, and the family moved constantly. By age 5, Duncan was already showing signs of severe behavioral problems. He tortured animals, set fires, and displayed an alarming fascination with violence that would only intensify as he grew older. At just 12 years old, he committed his first sexual assault against a younger child. It was a preview of the horrors to come. Throughout his teenage years, Duncan cycled in and out of juvenile detention centers and psychiatric facilities. Each time he convinced counselors and social workers that he was making progress, that he understood the gravity of his actions. But behind the facade of rehabilitation, something far darker was taking root. He began keeping detailed journals documenting his fantasies about kidnapping, torturing, and murdering children. These weren't fleeting thoughts. They were elaborate plans, complete with drawings and step-by-step instructions. In 1980, at 17, Duncan was convicted of raping a 14-year-old boy at gunpoint. He served 16 years in prison, but rather than being rehabilitated, he used the time to refine his methods. He studied other predators, learned from their mistakes, and planned for the day he would be released. Prison records show that he was a model inmate, polite and cooperative, giving no indication of the storm brewing inside his mind. When Duncan was released in 1996, he immediately began hunting. He moved frequently, never staying in one place long enough to establish a pattern. He worked odd jobs, often involving children, construction work near schools, delivery routes that took him through suburban neighborhoods. He was patient, methodical, always watching and waiting for the perfect opportunity. His first known victim after his release was Anthony Martinez, a 10-year-old boy from Riverside County, California. In April 1997, Anthony was playing near his home when Duncan approached him. The details of what followed are too horrific to describe in full, but Anthony's body was found weeks later in a remote desert location. The crime scene told a story of prolonged torture and unimaginable suffering. Duncan had taken his time, fulfilling every sick fantasy he had documented in his journals. But Anthony's murder was just the beginning. Over the next several years, Duncan moved through California, Oregon, and Washington, leaving a trail of missing children and shattered families in his wake. He was careful to target children from broken homes or those who were temporarily unsupervised. He studied their routines, learned their schedules, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. What made Duncan particularly dangerous was his intelligence and his understanding of law enforcement procedures. He knew how to avoid detection, how to dispose of evidence, and how to manipulate the system. He maintained an online blog where he wrote about his philosophical views on society and justice, presenting himself as a thoughtful, introspective individual. Nobody reading his posts would have suspected they were getting inside the mind of one of America's most dangerous predators. In 2005, Duncan's reign of terror reached its most horrific peak in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. He had been surveilling the Groween family for weeks, watching their routines, studying their home. On May 16th, he struck with devastating efficiency. Armed with a shotgun and zip ties, he broke into the family's home in the middle of the night. He murdered Brenda Groen, her boyfriend Mark McKenzie, and her 13-year-old son Slade with clinical precision. But his real targets were 8-year-old Shasta and 9-year-old Dylan Groen. Duncan kidnapped the two children and disappeared into the wilderness of northern Idaho and western Montana. For 7 weeks, he held them captive in remote campsites, subjecting them to horrors that defy comprehension. He documented everything with a video camera, creating a record of torture and abuse that would later be used as evidence against him. Dylan Groen did not survive the ordeal. His remains were found months later at a campsite Duncan had used. The case broke wide open on July 2nd, 2005, when Duncan made a fatal mistake. He took Shasta Groen to a Denny's restaurant in Coeur d'Alene, apparently confident that no one would recognize her. But a waitress noticed something off about the interaction between the man and the little girl. She called the police, and within minutes, Duncan was in custody. Shasta was finally safe, but the damage had been done. During his interrogation, Duncan showed no remorse. He was matter-of-fact about his crimes, describing them with the same tone someone might use to discuss the weather. He admitted to the murders of the Groween family members and provided details about Dylan's death. He also confessed to killing Anthony Martinez years earlier, finally closing that case for the devastated Martinez family. But Duncan's confessions revealed an even more horrifying truth. He claimed to have killed other children over the years, victims whose disappearances had never been connected to him. He spoke of bodies buried in remote locations across multiple states, of crimes that would never be solved because he was the only one who knew where the evidence was hidden. The trial was a media circus, with Duncan representing himself for portions of the proceedings. He used the courtroom as a platform to espouse his twisted philosophy, claiming that society had created him through its treatment of sex offenders. He showed no empathy for his victims or their families, instead focusing on his own perceived grievances against the system. In 2008, Duncan was sentenced to death for the murder of Dylan Groen. He received additional life sentences for the other murders and kidnapping charges. He was also tried and convicted in California for the murder of Anthony Martinez, receiving another death sentence. Throughout the legal proceedings, he remained unrepentant, even seeming to enjoy the attention his crimes had brought him. Duncan spent his final years on death row, continuing to maintain his innocence in some cases while bragging about others. He died of brain cancer in March 2021, taking with him the secrets of his other potential victims. His death brought some measure of closure to the families he had destroyed, but it also meant that other families might never know what happened to their missing children. The Duncan case exposed serious flaws in how society monitors and manages convicted sex offenders. Despite his lengthy criminal history and the clear danger he posed, he was able to move freely across state lines, change his identity, and continue hunting victims. His case led to significant reforms in sex offender registration and monitoring systems, though many argue these changes came too late. Shasta Groen, the sole survivor of Duncan's final rampage, has grown up to become an advocate for victims of violent crime. Her courage in testifying against Duncan and her strength in rebuilding her life stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. But her survival also serves as a reminder of how many other children weren't so fortunate. Joseph Edward Duncan III represented a particular type of evil, one that is calculated, patient, and utterly without redemption. He didn't kill in passion or delusion. He killed because he enjoyed it. He took pleasure in the suffering of innocent children and showed no capacity for remorse or rehabilitation. His crimes remind us that some monsters are very real, and they walk among us, hidden behind masks of normalcy until they decide to reveal their true nature. The most chilling aspect of Duncan's story isn't just what he did, it's how long he was able to do it. For decades, he moved through society like a ghost, hunting the most vulnerable members of our communities while maintaining the facade of a troubled but harmless drifter. His intelligence and cunning allowed him to evade detection far longer than someone of his obvious dangerousness should have been able to. The psychological profile of a serial killer often reveals a disturbing pattern of escalation, and few cases illustrate this more chillingly than that of Joseph Edward Duncan III. What began as childhood trauma and behavioral problems eventually spiraled into one of the most calculated and horrifying sprees of violence against children in American history. Duncan's crimes weren't random acts of rage or passion. They were methodical, planned, and executed with a level of premeditation that still haunts investigators today. Joseph Edward Duncan III was born in 1963 in Tacoma, Washington, into what appeared to be an ordinary middle-class family. But beneath the surface, dysfunction was already taking root. His father was emotionally distant and prone to violent outbursts. His mother struggled with depression and often left the children to fend for themselves for days at a time. By age 5, Duncan was already showing signs of severe behavioral problems. He tortured animals, set fires, and displayed an alarming lack of empathy toward other children. The first major red flag came when Duncan was just 12 years old. He sexually assaulted a younger boy at gunpoint, an act so shocking that even seasoned juvenile counselors were at a loss for how to handle it. Instead of receiving the intensive psychological intervention he desperately needed, Duncan was shuffled through a series of juvenile facilities and group homes. Each placement failed. Each failure made him more dangerous. What made Duncan particularly terrifying was his intelligence. He had an IQ well above average and could charm adults when he wanted to. Teachers and counselors often described him as articulate and insightful, capable of analyzing his own behavior with disturbing clarity. But this self-awareness never translated into genuine remorse or change. Instead, Duncan learned to manipulate the system, telling authorities what they wanted to hear while privately nurturing increasingly violent fantasies. By his late teens, Duncan had already served time in multiple juvenile facilities for sexual assault and other violent crimes. But the system kept releasing him, often with little more than probation and a requirement to attend counseling sessions he rarely took seriously. Each release gave him another opportunity to refine his methods and select new victims. Duncan's adult criminal career began in earnest in the early 1980s. He developed a pattern of targeting isolated families, particularly those with young children. He would conduct extensive surveillance, sometimes watching a family for weeks before making his move. He studied their routines, noted when parents left for work, observed which children walked to school alone. This wasn't impulsive violence, it was strategic hunting. His first known adult victims were the Groene family in rural Idaho. On May 16, 2005, Duncan broke into their home in the middle of the night. He bludgeoned to death Brenda Groene, her boyfriend Mark McKenzie, and her 13-year-old son Slade. But murder wasn't his ultimate goal. He kidnapped 8-year-old Shasta Groene and her 9-year-old brother Dylan, taking them to a remote campsite in the Montana wilderness. What followed was 7 weeks of unimaginable horror. Duncan had prepared the campsite in advance, stocking it with supplies, restraints, and recording equipment. He systematically tortured and sexually abused both children while documenting everything on video. Dylan was eventually murdered, but Duncan kept Shasta alive for reasons that still chill investigators. He seemed to view her as a long-term project, someone he could mold and control completely. The only reason Shasta survived was pure chance. Duncan grew overconfident and took her to a restaurant in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. A waitress recognized the girl from news reports and called police. When officers arrived, they found Duncan calmly eating dinner while Shasta sat beside him, hollow-eyed and traumatized beyond measure. During his interrogation, Duncan displayed the same chilling detachment that had characterized his entire life. He spoke about his crimes with clinical precision, describing the murders and abuse as if discussing the weather. When asked why he targeted children, his response was simple. They were easier to control and less likely to fight back effectively. He showed no remorse for the lives he had destroyed, only frustration that he had been caught. But the Groween family wasn't Duncan's only victim. As investigators dug deeper into his background, they uncovered a trail of violence spanning decades and multiple states. In 1997, he had kidnapped and murdered 10-year-old Anthony Martinez in California. The boy had been riding his bike near his home when Duncan lured him away. Anthony's body was found months later in a remote desert location, showing signs of prolonged torture and abuse. Duncan was also linked to the disappearance of two young brothers in Seattle in 1996. Sammy and Alex Ramos, ages 11 and 10, vanished while walking home from school. Their bodies were never found, but Duncan's detailed confessions left no doubt about their fate. He described taking them to an abandoned warehouse, where he kept them for several days before killing them and disposing of their remains. What made Duncan's crimes particularly disturbing was the level of planning involved. He maintained detailed journals documenting his fantasies and plans for future attacks. He researched potential victims online, using social media and public records to identify vulnerable families. He even created fake identities and maintained multiple residences to avoid detection. Duncan's journals, discovered after his arrest, revealed the mind of someone who viewed other human beings as nothing more than objects for his gratification. He wrote extensively about his desire to cause pain and his belief that he was superior to his victims. There was no mental illness defense here, no claim of diminished capacity. Duncan knew exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. The impact on the surviving victims cannot be overstated. Shasta Groween, who was 8 years old when she was kidnapped, has struggled with trauma for the rest of her life. She has spoken publicly about the lasting effects of her ordeal, describing nightmares, anxiety, and difficulty forming relationships. Her courage in testifying against Duncan was instrumental in securing his conviction, but the cost to her personally was immense. Duncan's case exposed serious flaws in the criminal justice system handling of violent offenders. Despite multiple convictions for sexual assault and other violent crimes, he had been released from prison just months before the Groween family murders. Parole officers had lost track of him, and he had violated the terms of his supervised release multiple times without consequences. The investigation also revealed Duncan's extensive use of the internet to research victims and connect with other predators. He maintained several online personas and participated in forums dedicated to child exploitation. This digital footprint provided investigators with crucial evidence, but also highlighted how technology could be weaponized by criminals. In court, Duncan's attorneys attempted to argue that his troubled childhood and history of abuse had damaged his ability to control his impulses. Mental health experts testified about the cycle of abuse and how childhood trauma can lead to violent behavior in adulthood. But the prosecution successfully argued that Duncan's meticulous planning and ability to evade capture for years proved he was fully aware of his actions and their consequences. The jury took less than a day to convict Duncan on all charges. He was sentenced to death for the federal kidnapping charges and received multiple life sentences for the state charges. Throughout the proceedings, he showed no emotion, occasionally taking notes, but never displaying any sign of remorse or regret. Duncan's case became a catalyst for changes in how law enforcement handles missing children cases and monitors high-risk offenders. The Amber Alert system was expanded, and new protocols were developed for tracking paroled sex offenders. But for the families of his victims, no amount of systemic change could undo the damage he had caused. Joseph Edward Duncan III died in prison in 2021 while awaiting execution. He was 58 years old and had spent the last 16 years of his life in solitary confinement. His death brought a measure of closure to some of his victims' families, but the trauma he inflicted continues to ripple through their lives. Duncan's story serves as a stark reminder that evil can be methodical, patient, and devastatingly effective. He wasn't a creature of impulse or a victim of circumstances beyond his control. He was a predator who made conscious choices to destroy innocent lives for his own gratification. The fact that he operated for decades, moving freely between states and accumulating victims, reveals troubling gaps in our systems designed to protect the most vulnerable members of society. The children who died at Duncan's hands, Dylan Groen, Anthony Martinez, Sami and Alex Ramos, and others whose names may never be known, deserved to grow up to experience all the joys and challenges of life. Instead, they became statistics in the case file of a monster who saw them as nothing more than objects for his twisted desires. The psychology of evil is perhaps most disturbing when it manifests in those who should protect the most vulnerable. Throughout history, some of the most heinous crimes have been committed not by strangers lurking in shadows, but by those who gained access to their victims through trust, authority, or circumstance. Today, we delve into one such case that shocked America and revealed how evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades. In 1995, in the quiet suburbs of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, residents believed they lived in one of the safest places in America. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, children playing in front yards without a care in the world. It was the kind of community where neighbors knew each other, where doors were left unlocked, and where the biggest crime was usually a stolen bicycle. But beneath this veneer of safety, a predator was watching, waiting, and planning acts so depraved that they would shatter this community's innocence forever. Joseph Edward Duncan III was born in 1963 in Tacoma, Washington. To those who knew him casually, he seemed unremarkable. Average height, quiet demeanor, the kind of person who blended into crowds and was quickly forgotten. But behind his ordinary appearance was a mind consumed by the darkest fantasies imaginable. From an early age, Duncan exhibited troubling behaviors that should have been warning signs. He tortured small animals, set fires, and displayed an unsettling fascination with violence and control. As a teenager, Duncan's behavior escalated dramatically. At just 16 years old, he committed his first known serious crime, sexually assaulting a younger boy at gunpoint. The attack was brutal, calculated, and showed a level of premeditation that horrified investigators. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity, it was the deliberate act of someone who had been planning and fantasizing about such violence for years. Duncan was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 20 years in prison, but the system failed in ways that would have catastrophic consequences decades later. During his incarceration, Duncan wasn't rehabilitated. He was educated in new methods of violence and manipulation. Prison became his graduate school in criminal behavior. He studied other predators, learned from their mistakes, and refined his own twisted methodologies. When he was released after serving only 14 years, he emerged as a far more dangerous and sophisticated predator than when he entered. The 1990s saw Duncan drift across the Pacific Northwest, a transient figure who moved from job to job, relationship to relationship, always maintaining the facade of normalcy while secretly indulging his darkest urges. He worked construction, odd jobs, anything that paid cash and didn't require extensive background checks. To employers and casual acquaintances, he seemed like just another guy trying to get by. They had no idea they were interacting with someone who spent his nights prowling the internet, seeking victims and planning abductions. Duncan's method was meticulous and terrifying in its simplicity. He would identify families with young children, often through online research or by physically surveilling neighborhoods. He looked for homes that were isolated, families that seemed vulnerable, situations where he could strike with minimal risk of detection. His planning could take weeks or even months. He would study his targets' routines, learn their schedules, identify the best times and methods for attack. What made Duncan particularly dangerous was his ability to compartmentalize. During the day, he could function normally, hold conversations, even charm people when necessary. But at night, or when the opportunity presented itself, he transformed into something else entirely. This wasn't the uncontrolled rage of a crime of passion. This was the cold, calculated execution of long-held fantasies. In May of 2005, Duncan's careful planning came to its horrific fruition. He had been watching the Groene family for weeks. Brenda Groene, a single mother of 3, lived with her boyfriend Mark Mackenzie and her children Slade, Dylan, and Shasta in a modest home outside Coeur d'Alene. To Duncan, they represented the perfect target, isolated enough for him to work without interruption, vulnerable enough for him to overpower. On the evening of May 16th, Duncan struck with devastating efficiency. Armed with a shotgun and zip ties, he entered the Groene home and immediately took control of the situation. What happened next was so brutal that even seasoned investigators struggled to process the scene. Duncan bound the family members and then, in an act of incomprehensible cruelty, murdered Brenda Groene, her boyfriend Mark Mackenzie, and 13-year-old Slade with a hammer. The violence was excessive, personal, suggesting that Duncan took pleasure not just in the killing, but in that act of domination and terror. But murder wasn't Duncan's ultimate goal. It was merely a means to an end. His real objective was the abduction of 8-year-old Dylan and 9-year-old Shasta Groene. After killing the adults and Slade, Duncan loaded the 2 surviving children into his vehicle and drove them to a remote campsite he had prepared in advance. What followed was weeks of unimaginable horror as Duncan held the children captive, subjecting them to repeated sexual assault and psychological torture. Duncan didn't just abuse these children, he documented his crimes with photos and videos, creating a permanent record of their suffering for his own gratification. He treated their pain as entertainment, their terror as a source of pleasure. The level of psychological manipulation was staggering. He alternated between violence and false kindness, creating a Stockholm Syndrome-like dependency where the children became afraid to try to escape, even when opportunities presented themselves. For 7 weeks, Dylan and Shasta endured this nightmare, while law enforcement agencies across multiple states launched one of the largest manhunts in regional history. The discovery of the murdered family members had shocked the community and triggered a massive investigation. But Duncan had planned well. His campsite was remote and well hidden. His movements were careful and deliberate, and he had supplies to sustain himself and his captives for an extended period. The break in the case came not through brilliant detective work, but through Duncan's own arrogance and need for normalcy. On July the 2nd, 2005, Duncan made a critical error. Believing he was safe and undetected, he took Shasta Growing to a Denny's restaurant in Coeur d'Alene. It was a bizarre decision that revealed the twisted psychology at work. Even while holding a kidnapped child, Duncan felt compelled to engage in normal activities, as if he could compartmentalize his crimes and still participate in everyday life. A waitress at the restaurant recognized Shasta from the massive media coverage of her disappearance. She quietly alerted authorities, and within minutes, police surrounded the restaurant. Duncan was arrested without incident, but the damage was already done. During the 7 weeks of captivity, Duncan had murdered Dylan Growing, ending the young boy's life when he became too difficult to control. Shasta was rescued alive, but the trauma she had endured would affect her for the rest of her life. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of Duncan's crimes. Searches of his belongings uncovered not just evidence of the Growing family murders and kidnappings, but also materials linking him to other unsolved cases across the country. Duncan had been operating as a serial predator for years, possibly decades, leaving a trail of victims that law enforcement is still working to identify. In custody, Duncan initially attempted to maintain his innocence, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. DNA evidence, witness testimony, and his own documented records of abuse made denial impossible. Eventually, he began to confess, not out of remorse, but seemingly out of a desire to relive his crimes through the telling. His confessions were chilling in their detail and complete lack of empathy for his victims. What emerged from Duncan's statements was a portrait of a man who had never felt genuine human connection or empathy. He viewed other people, particularly children, not as individuals with their own rights and dignity, but as objects to be used for his gratification. He spoke about his crimes with the same casual tone someone might use to describe a hobby or interest. The disconnect between the horror of his actions and his emotional response to them was profound and deeply disturbing. The legal proceedings against Duncan were complicated by the multi-jurisdictional nature of his crimes and the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. He was ultimately convicted on multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. The prosecution sought the death penalty, arguing that the heinous nature of his crimes warranted the ultimate punishment. Duncan's defense team attempted to argue for life imprisonment, citing his mental illness and traumatic childhood, but the jury was unmoved by these mitigating factors. In 2008, Joseph Edward Duncan III was sentenced to death for his crimes against the Growing family. Additional charges in other jurisdictions meant he faced multiple life sentences, even if his death sentence was overturned. He was transferred to federal death row, where he would spend the remainder of his life in solitary confinement, awaiting execution. But Duncan's story didn't end with his sentencing. Even on death row, he continued to be a source of concern for authorities. He maintained correspondence with various individuals, some of whom were suspected of sharing his predatory interests. He also continued to provide information about unsolved cases, sometimes offering details that only the perpetrator would know, but often in ways that seem designed to prolong his relevance and maintain attention rather than provide genuine assistance to victims' families. The impact of Duncan's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims. The Groene family murders shattered the sense of security in Coeur d'Alene and surrounding communities. Parents became more protective of their children. Neighborhoods that had once been open and trusting became more guarded and suspicious. The case also highlighted significant gaps in the criminal justice system's ability to monitor and control repeat violent offenders. Duncan's ability to operate undetected for so long raised serious questions about sex offender registration and monitoring systems. Despite his previous conviction and known history of violence against children, he had been able to move freely across state lines, change addresses without proper notification, and access potential victims without triggering any systematic alerts. The case became a catalyst for reforms in how violent sex offenders are tracked and supervised after their release from prison. For Shasta Groene, the sole survivor of Duncan's attack on her family, the journey toward healing has been long and difficult. The trauma she experienced during those 7 weeks of captivity, combined with the loss of her mother, brother, and stepfather, created wounds that may never fully heal. She has bravely chosen to speak publicly about her experiences on occasion, using her voice to advocate for other victims and to push for stronger protections for children. The psychological profile that emerged from Duncan's case has been studied extensively by criminal psychologists and law enforcement professionals. His ability to function normally in social situations while harboring such violent fantasies, his meticulous planning and preparation, and his complete lack of empathy for his victims make him a textbook example of the organized predator. Understanding how such individuals think and operate is crucial for developing better methods of detection and prevention. In March 2021, Joseph Edward Duncan III died in federal prison of brain cancer. He was 58 years old and had spent the last 13 years of his life on death row. His death brought a measure of closure to some, but for the families of his victims, particularly Shasta Groene, his passing could never truly heal the wounds he had inflicted. The evil he had perpetrated would continue to echo through the lives of those he had touched long after his own life ended. The case of Joseph Edward Duncan III serves as a stark reminder that evil often wears the most ordinary faces. He wasn't a mythical monster or a character from a horror film. He was a real person who made conscious choices to inflict unimaginable suffering on innocent victims. His crimes weren't the result of a moment of passion or a single bad decision. They were the product of years of planning, fantasy, and escalating violence. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the realization that Duncan is not unique. There are others like him operating in communities across the country, hiding behind facades of normalcy while harboring the darkest intentions. The challenge for law enforcement and society as a whole is developing better methods for identifying and stopping such predators before they can act on their violent fantasies. The price of failure, as the Groene family learned so tragically, is measured not just in individual lives lost, but in the destruction of entire families and communities. The story of Joseph Edward Duncan III is one that challenges our fundamental assumptions about human nature and the capacity for evil. The psychological profile of these killers reveals disturbing patterns that help us understand how evil can hide in plain sight. What makes these cases particularly chilling isn't just the brutality of their crimes, but the calculated way each killer exploited the trust and vulnerabilities of those around them. Andre Chikatilo operated for over a decade in a system that refused to acknowledge serial killing could exist in Soviet society. His ability to blend into his role as a teacher and family man while committing increasingly savage murders demonstrates how predators can compartmentalize their lives. The bureaucratic failures that allowed him to continue killing weren't just administrative oversights, they were systemic blind spots that he learned to exploit. Each time he was questioned and released, his confidence grew. He understood that his ordinary appearance and position in society provided the perfect camouflage. Dorothy Williams represents perhaps the most insidious form of serial killing. As a healthcare worker, she held a position of absolute trust. Patients and families looked to her for comfort in their most vulnerable moments, never suspecting she was the source of their suffering. Her method was almost undetectable, hidden within the natural course of illness and death. She didn't need to overpower her victims or stalk them through dark alleys. They came to her willingly, seeking help. The very environment that should have been a sanctuary became her hunting ground. What's particularly disturbing about Williams is how she seemed to derive satisfaction from the grief of families. Colleagues reported that she often volunteered to comfort bereaved relatives, positioning herself at the center of the tragedy she had orchestrated. This wasn't just about killing, it was about psychological domination and the perverse pleasure of being thanked for her compassion by people whose loved ones she had murdered. David Carpenter, the trailside killer, exploited society's trust in shared outdoor spaces. Parks and hiking trails represent freedom and natural beauty, places where people go to escape the dangers of urban life. Carpenter turned these sanctuaries into hunting grounds, using his knowledge of remote locations and his ability to appear harmless to lure victims into isolated areas where they had no hope of rescue. His stutter, which might have made him seem vulnerable or sympathetic, became part of his predatory toolkit. The servant girl annihilator operated in an era when forensic science was primitive and communication between law enforcement agencies was virtually non-existent. But beyond these technical limitations, the killer demonstrated an understanding of social dynamics that allowed him to move through different communities undetected. The fact that many victims were domestic workers, immigrants, or people from marginalized communities meant their deaths didn't receive the same attention or resources as murders in more affluent areas. The killer seemed to understand this disparity and exploited it so ruthlessly. Joseph Duncan III represents the evolution of predatory behavior in the digital age. Unlike the other killers we've examined, Duncan had access to technology that allowed him to research victims, plan crimes with unprecedented detail, and even document his fantasies online. His blog entries reveal a mind that was not only capable of unspeakable violence, but was actively working to justify and rationalize it. He didn't just commit crimes, he created an entire philosophical framework to support his actions. Duncan's ability to present himself as a harmless drifter while carrying out some of the most horrific crimes in recent memory shows how predators have adapted to modern society. He understood that mobility was his greatest asset, moving between states and jurisdictions before patterns could be established. He also recognized that children from troubled homes or chaotic family situations were less likely to be immediately missed, giving him more time to carry out his plans. What unites all these killers is their patience and their ability to study human behavior. They weren't impulsive criminals acting in the heat of passion. They were methodical predators who spent considerable time observing potential victims, learning their routines, and identifying their vulnerabilities. This patience allowed them to strike when conditions were optimal and disappear before suspicion could focus on them. Each of these killers also demonstrated a profound lack of empathy that went beyond simple callousness. They seemed incapable of viewing their victims as human beings with their own hopes, fears, and connections to others. To them, victims were objects to be manipulated and discarded. This dehumanization was essential to their ability to commit such brutal acts repeatedly without being overwhelmed by guilt or remorse. The investigation and capture of these killers often came down to small mistakes or pieces of unexpected evidence rather than brilliant detective work. Chikatilo was caught during a routine document check. Williams was exposed when statistical analysis revealed impossible mortality rates in her care. Duncan was identified through DNA evidence from earlier crimes. This suggests that many of them might have continued killing indefinitely if not for these chance discoveries. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the realization that these 5 killers represent only a fraction of the predators who have operated throughout history. For every case that's been solved, how many others remain hidden in cold case files or were never even recognized as connected crimes? The techniques these killers used, their ability to exploit social blind spots and institutional failures, suggest that others with similar capabilities may still be operating today. The legacy of these crimes extends far beyond the immediate victims. Families were destroyed, communities were terrorized, and faith in basic social institutions was shattered. The knowledge that evil can wear such ordinary faces and operate within trusted institutions creates a paranoia that can poison entire communities for generations. These cases serve as stark reminders that the monsters we fear aren't always hiding in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. Sometimes they're sitting in the next pew at church, caring for patients in hospitals, teaching children in schools, or camping at the site next to yours. They've learned to weaponize our trust, our compassion, and our basic human need to believe that most people are fundamentally good. The study of these killers isn't just academic exercise. Understanding how they operated, how they selected victims, and how they avoided detection for so long can help us recognize similar patterns in the future. It can inform better training for law enforcement, improved safety protocols in vulnerable institutions, and more effective ways to protect potential victims. But perhaps most importantly, these stories remind us that evil rarely announces itself with fanfare. It creeps in quietly, wearing familiar faces and speaking comforting words. The psychological profiles of these predators reveal disturbing patterns that extend far beyond their individual crimes. Each operated with a calculated awareness of societal blind spots, exploiting the very systems designed to protect us. What makes their stories particularly haunting is how they weaponized normalcy itself, turning everyday interactions into hunting grounds. André Chikatilo understood that his role as a teacher granted him unquestioned access to children. He studied their routines, their vulnerabilities, their trust. His methodical approach wasn't born from impulse, but from years of observing how society functioned, how authority figures moved through communities without suspicion. The Soviet system's reluctance to acknowledge serial killers provided him with an additional layer of protection, allowing him to operate for over a decade while investigators chased shadows and scapegoats. Dorothy Williams recognized that healthcare environments bred a unique form of vulnerability. Patients in her care were already weakened, isolated from their support systems, dependent on the very person who meant them harm. She manipulated the sacred trust between caregiver and patient, understanding that her actions would be attributed to natural causes or medical complications. The inherent chaos of hospital settings, where death was unfortunately common, provided perfect camouflage for her deliberate killings. David Carpenter's choice of hiking trails wasn't random. He understood that these locations attracted people seeking solitude, individuals who had deliberately removed themselves from populated areas where help might be available. His knowledge of the terrain, combined with his unassuming appearance as a fellow outdoor enthusiast, allowed him to approach victims without triggering alarm. The remote locations meant that by the time bodies were discovered, crucial evidence had been compromised by weather and wildlife. The servant girl annihilator operated during a time when forensic science was in its infancy and communication between law enforcement agencies was limited. Austin's rapid growth meant that many residents were newcomers without established community ties, making it easier for someone to move through different neighborhoods without being recognized. The killer exploited racial tensions and social divisions, knowing that crimes against certain populations would receive less attention and fewer resources. Joseph Duncan's understanding of modern technology and social media gave him tools that previous generations of predators could never have imagined. He used the internet not just to access victims, but to study law enforcement techniques, legal precedents, and investigative procedures. His ability to manipulate digital footprints and create false identities online allowed him to maintain multiple hunting grounds simultaneously while staying ahead of authorities. What emerges from these cases is a chilling portrait of predators who functioned as amateur sociologists, studying human behavior and institutional weaknesses with the dedication of researchers. They identified the gaps where oversight failed, where assumptions about safety created dangerous vulnerabilities, where societal taboos prevented open discussion of uncomfortable truths. Their success relied heavily on what psychologists call the halo effect, the tendency for positive traits in one area to influence perception in others. A teacher, a nurse, a fellow hiker, a community member. These roles came with built-in credibility that made people lower their guard. The predators understood that appearing helpful, professional, or harmless was more effective than any disguise or deception. Perhaps most disturbing is how they weaponized empathy itself. They presented themselves as people in need of assistance, companionship, or trust. They exploited humanity's fundamental desire to help others, turning compassion into a vulnerability that could be exploited. This manipulation went beyond simple deception. It was a calculated assault on the very qualities that make communities function. The lasting impact of their crimes extends far beyond their direct victims. Families were shattered not just by loss, but by the betrayal of trust, the violation of spaces that should have been safe. Communities were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about how evil could hide in plain sight, how the people entrusted with care and protection could become the very sources of harm. These cases also highlight systemic failures that allowed the predators to operate for extended periods. Inadequate communication between agencies, reluctance to acknowledge uncomfortable patterns, insufficient resources for investigating crimes against marginalized populations, and outdated investigative techniques all contributed to delayed justice. The predators didn't just exploit individual vulnerabilities, they exploited institutional ones as well. Understanding these cases requires acknowledging that evil rarely announces itself with obvious warning signs. These predators succeeded because they understood how to blend in, how to appear normal, how to exploit the assumptions and blind spots that allow society to function. They were patient, observant, and ruthlessly practical in their approach to causing harm. Their stories serve as stark reminders that safety isn't just about individual awareness. It requires robust systems, open communication, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable realities about how predators operate. The most dangerous individuals are often those who appear least threatening, who occupy positions of trust, who understand how to manipulate both their victims and the systems meant to protect them. The true horror of these cases lies not in their brutality, though that was certainly present, but in their calculated nature. These weren't crimes of passion or desperation. They were methodical campaigns of terror carried out by individuals who had made peace with their choice to cause immeasurable harm. These cases reveal a disturbing truth about the nature of evil in our society. Each of these killers operated not as the wild, uncontrolled monsters we see in horror films, but as methodical predators who understood how to exploit the very systems designed to protect us. They weaponized trust, anonymity, and social blind spots with chilling effectiveness. What makes these stories particularly haunting is how ordinary these individuals appeared to those around them. Chikatilo was a teacher and father. Williams was a trusted healthcare worker. Carpenter seemed like any other retiree. The servant girl annihilator moved through Austin undetected for years. Duncan blended seamlessly into suburban life while planning his next attack. This ordinariness wasn't accidental, it was their greatest weapon. These killers succeeded because they understood something fundamental about human psychology. We want to trust. We want to believe that the person sitting next to us on the bus, treating us in the hospital, or living in our neighborhood is fundamentally decent. They exploited this basic human need for social cohesion, using our own instincts for community and trust against us. The institutional failures in each case are equally troubling. Soviet authorities dismissed Chikatilo's early crimes due to ideological blindness. Hospital administrators failed to investigate suspicious death patterns around Williams. Police departments lacked the resources and coordination to track Carpenter's multi-jurisdictional crimes. Austin's social divisions prevented unified investigation efforts. Duncan's online activities went unmonitored despite clear warning signs. Perhaps most unsettling is how these cases demonstrate that evil often wins not through superior intelligence or elaborate planning, but through patience and persistence. These killers succeeded because they were willing to wait, to watch, to learn their victims' patterns and vulnerabilities. They understood that most people don't expect to encounter true malevolence in their daily lives. The randomness of their eventual capture is equally chilling. Most weren't caught through brilliant detective work or advanced forensics. They were caught through accidents, coincidences, and their own eventual carelessness. This suggests that for every killer we've discussed today, there may be others still operating, still waiting, still hunting. These stories serve as more than cautionary tales. They're reminders that evil doesn't announce itself with dramatic flourishes or obvious signs. It often wears the mask of normalcy, politeness, even helpfulness. The real monsters among us aren't the ones who look the part. They're the ones who've learned to look like everyone else. Understanding these cases isn't about feeding our fascination with darkness. It's about recognizing the warning signs, supporting better institutional safeguards, and remembering that vigilance isn't paranoia. Sometimes it's survival. The victims of these killers deserved better protection, better investigation, and better justice. Their stories remind us that the price of safety is eternal watchfulness, not just by law enforcement, but by all of us. Evil exists. It's patient, it's calculating, and it's counting on our assumption that it doesn't live next door.